You are now entering a dangerous liberty zone where God-given natural rights are held sacred and exercised. This is your warning. Tyranny, fascism, ideas will be exchanged freely. Rigorous debate and open discourse is encouraged. If you are weak and your beliefs are fragile, you should leave now. Prepare yourself. We are now live on the Dangerous Liberty Podcast. All right. Happy Wednesday, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Dangerous Liberty Podcast. Folks, we got a great show for you tonight. I think you're going to find it extremely interesting, and I think it may open your mind. For those of you that are red-pilled, you're going to get even more red-pilled. But welcome to the Dangerous Liberty Podcast, where we know that safety at the expense of liberty is slavery. I want to say hi to everybody over in the comment section already. We got Jason T.G. Sponsler. We got Jeff Johnson. We got, I'm just going to say, Amy Atkinson, Alan Pinford, Mike Hinn, Con, good to see you. Lori Matthews, good to see you. And everybody else that is just now tuning in. Make sure you guys say hello in the comments, and I will try to get to you. We're going to do things a little bit differently right now. Right now, I got Dane, our guest, on hold, and I'm going to read his bio in just a minute, but then we're going to play a quick and short clip of his documentary, The Dimming. And I'll tell you what, just the portion I'm going to play you completely changed my mind. And I'll just tell you right up front, folks, we're going to be talking about weather manipulation. And I will, going back, if you'd have brought this up to me 6 months ago, I'd have laughed at you. I'm not going to lie. As a matter of fact, the reason that I was even became aware of Dane's work was somebody brought up chemtrails on a podcast in the chat. And I was like, oh God, okay. All right, cuckoo bird. And then after that, somebody sent me, it was that same person sent me some links, and it was basically like, Gary, you should check this out before you think you know what you're talking about. And I ended up watching the documentary, The Dimming, which there's a link to that in the description of this video. So make sure you hit that. And again, make sure you all like, subscribe, make sure you hit that bell icon so you're notified when we put out new content like this. And I also got several resource links to Dane's content as well as YouTube channel, geoengineeringwatch.org. There's a ton of content on there and resources. And I will tell you right now, everything that we're going to talk about, there is extremely strong evidence for. And going back to the chemtrails, that was a bridge too far for me. And, I'll be honest with you. I think most of you know, I'm not all that, I don't believe in too many conspiracies. There's definitely, I believe that there's out there, but a lot of the things that people think are conspiracies are usually not. And then the most obvious conspiracies to me, I think most people are blind to. But we've talked a lot about those types of things on this show. Evil Freak, good to see you, buddy. Scav14, good to see you. And many other folks. We're live right now on Rumble. That's another thing. Hey, all of our lost boys and girls over on Rumble, I want to say hi to you guys. ET, good to see you. And we are live on X as well as Facebook. So real quick, I'm going to give you guys a real quick bio or background for Dane Wigington. Dane Wigington is the executive producer for the groundbreaking climate engineering documentary, The Dimming. He has a background in solar energy and was a former employee of Bechtel Power Corporation. Dane was also a licensed contractor in California and Arizona. His personal residence was featured in a cover article on the world's largest renewable energy magazine, Home Power. He owns and manages a wildlife preserve next to Lake Shasta in Northern California. Dan made a decision to focus all his efforts, energy, and resources on full-time investigation of the geoengineering solar radiation management issue when he began to lose very significant amounts of solar uptake due to ever-increasing solar obscuration and global dimming. The scenario was being caused from highly visible and ongoing jet aircraft spraying aerosol dispersions. Dane also noted a significant and accelerating decline in overall forest health, along with rapidly increasing UV radiation levels. These factors and others were catalysts that triggered Dane's testing and research into the geoengineering issue for the last 2 decades. As the lead researcher for geoengineeringwatch.org, Dane has investigated all levels of geoengineering, solar radiation management, in global ionosphere heater facilities like the HARP. Dane has appeared on an extensive number of interviews and films to explain the environmental dangers we face on a global level from the ongoing climate engineering assault. Dane has been featured on many TV and news broadcasts, was a guest on Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s podcast. I would highly recommend you go watch that. That is also linked down in the description. But Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is aware of this issue. He actually had Dane on to explain it and to bring awareness to this issue. And you guys may not know Dane, but I think many of you know Robert F. Kennedy and understand that, again, he's not going to present something without evidence. And I think you guys are going to see some of that evidence. So what I'm going to do right now before we bring on Dane is I'm going to go ahead and we're going to play this video real quick. Just a snippet of it, and we will go from there.
Perhaps the greatest lie ever perpetrated on populations all over the world is the condensation trail lie. What we're seeing in our skies is not condensation. It's sprayed particulate dispersions with very few exceptions.
They shouldn't be there. Jet engines burn clean. So if there's anything coming out of them, it's an additive.
They're absolutely not contrails. Contrails do not linger, dissipate, and go into cloud coverage, period, in the report.
And I kept saying to people, you know, what is this? Because now the sky is no longer blue. It's starting to turn gray. And what I found was kind of like it was not socially acceptable. You know, we're all going to pretend this is not really happening. And I thought, oh, this is very bad.
Most are unfamiliar with a science term called global dimming. That term refers to the amount of direct sunlight that no longer reaches the surface of the planet due to light scattering particles that are building up in the atmosphere. And although many of these particles are from industrialized pollution, the larger majority are from the ongoing climate engineering solar radiation management operations. This engine, a high bypass turbofan jet engine, this is the engine that is on all military tankers and all commercial carriers, is in essence a jet-powered fan. 90% of the air that moves through this engine is non-combusted. This engine, by design, is nearly incapable of producing any condensation trail except under rare and extreme circumstances. And again, you know, we have film footage of aircraft flying at altitude with nozzles visible, turning on and off. That is the end of the argument. Since even before man could fly, there was an effort to try to modify the weather. We have weather modification patents going back 100 years plus.
These are historical films of what can be done with a biplane, a small biplane that carries a very small payload. And that much can be done. How much more can a fully loaded military tanker, KC-10, KC-135, C-17 Globemaster, how much more material can they put in the air? About 500 times more with a single tanker.
In regard to the condensation trail narrative, many refer back to the trails left by World War II bombers as proof that we're only seeing condensation trails in our skies. But geoengineeringwatch.org found on military archives film footage, which we posted, of World War II B-17s at altitude turning off a sprayed dispersion. We know that climate engineering was deployed immediately after World War II, so testing was absolutely ongoing. Clearly, these bombers were used for beta testing. Film footage proves it.
Weather was a weapon used over Vietnam. Would you expect that to be then deleted from the availability? No. to continue to expand the scientific aspects of it, to have it available in your portfolio of weapons would be a natural process. Therefore, should you expect that it is available on demand to have the ability to modify weather? Absolutely, within this country and others.
Climate engineering is the crown jewel of the military-industrial complex. Climate engineering has been used to destabilize and topple nations all over the globe, facilitating military occupations by hostile countries like the US. We know that some of these countries are having their precipitation cut off because they have stated so on the floor of the UN, like the president of Iran stating emphatically that NATO weather modification programs were cutting off the precipitation to Iran, but US media never covered it.
We have an economic model operating globally, which is operating based on covert force. And I have very serious questions after watching the financial patterns as to whether that financial force or that force includes weather warfare.
People were coming to me, telling me about this. So because of that, I went to the government in Ottawa under Freedom of Information. It was a 40-page report, of which half the pages were completely blank, and the other half had a lot of blank outs. But there was sufficient information to tell me that, yeah, they're aware. They call it geoengineering.
One of the big problems is that when we find some new technology, we get all excited by it, by the potential benefits of that technology, and often implement it and use the technology before we have any idea of the negative effects.
Shouldn't it be considered that every breath we take is laden with highly toxic particles that are wreaking havoc in our own bodies? Particles that aren't being reported by any air quality testing systems. Any official air quality testing are looking for PM10 or PM2.5, 2.5 microns at best. The climate engineering nanoparticulates are exponentially smaller. They go virtually unreported.
These nanomaterials generate reactive oxygen species in biological materials, damage tissue, lead to advanced aging, cause cancer, causative agents of dementia. So, yeah, we might think that we're doing something positive for humanity to save our species, but we're also poisoning ourselves.
Eventually, with the team that we formed at geoengineeringwatch.org, we were able to acquire a NOAA flying lab. We were able to test at altitude to confirm the elements that were showing up at the surface.
Our intention was to do a point-to-point sampling mission. We could see these obvious patterns that were being laid out in the sky. We were really thankful for the opportunity to be able to get up to altitude. And on the return mission, we noticed that that cloud layer had descended. And we sampled below the cloud layer, we sampled through that confluent layer and above it.
We found exactly the same elements listed in climate engineering patents, same elements we found on countless surface tests of precipitation from all over the globe.
All right, we're going to stop it right there, but I think you all get the point. I definitely encourage each and every one of you to go finish watching that documentary. It is on geoengineeringwatch.org. You can go watch that entire documentary, and it is completely filled with evidence-based information on there. And, you know, that's, it's really hard to argue with. So, again, just going back a few months, I would have said this chemtrail stuff is nonsense. But without further ado, I want to go ahead and welcome Dane Wigington to the show. He is actually in the middle of prepping his property to make sure that his property doesn't burn down. And he's not going to be able to be on the video, but he's on a call with us. So, Dane, welcome to the show, and thank you for taking the time. We really appreciate it.
Thank you very much for your voice in this very critical battle, Gary, and to all your listeners, thank you for being willing to investigate.
Yeah, Dane, we got a little sample of what's going on. I know that that documentary is about an hour and 50 minutes, I think, something along those lines. And you present a lot more information, but I just wanted to give people kind of a baseline of what we're dealing with and where we're at with that. And, you know, now we have these fires there in California, and I know you and I talked quite a bit yesterday about that and how it's related. I guess let's start off with the basics so that everybody's on the same page. When we talk about geoengineering in general, what are you referencing by that term to begin with?
The intentional intervention in the planet's primary life support systems, climate systems. And that's what the geoengineering term refers to. And if I could back up just a bit, Gary.
Sure.
So they know the voices that they heard in that clip to the dimming were U.S. Air Force generals, former U.S. presidential cabinet members, former premier of British Columbia and Canada, top scientists. These are the people that are speaking out on the record. And for U.S. Air Force generals to openly acknowledge these programs, why isn't that headline news? Because they're trying everything they can to hide these programs for obvious reasons. If the public wakes up to the fact that this has been done to them without their knowledge or consent, I would argue that's the pitchforks and torches moment, because every single weather cataclysm becomes then a liability for anyone and everyone involved in these programs. So bottom line, this is the issue they will do everything in their power to hide and deny until the last possible moment. So the climate intervention operations, again, the stated purpose to put light scattering particles in the sky with no consideration of the consequences, the toxic fallout, the destruction of the ozone layer, disruption of hydrological cycle, but the stated purpose to put light scattering particles in the sky to slow down the warming of the planet by blocking some of the sun's incoming thermal energy. And if they continue these operations, and they're using them for weather warfare, period. Again, I want to make that clear. There's no true benevolence in these programs, but if they continue, we're on a very short timeline, all of us.
So when we talk about these chemicals that they're using, I know, again, you go into a lot of depth in the documentary, and you talk about what exactly they're doing. But for the audience here, explain to them what chemicals, what particulates they're actually spraying in the atmosphere and what they're trying to achieve by that, and then ultimately how that affects us here on the ground.
The elements we know of listed in climate engineering patents and showing up in our precipitation tests, starting with aluminum, barium, strontium, manganese, polymer fibers, surfactants, graphene. All of these elements are, of course, highly toxic. And in nanoparticle form, any element's toxic. When you have particles that small, and for your listeners, if they don't know how small that is, it's inconceivably small. You can fit 100,000 nanoparticles across the width of a single human hair. That's too small to even really comprehend. But when they're that small, they're very bioavailable and very bioaccumulative, which means they're easily absorbed, very hard to get rid of. And so now we're talking about toxic elements that size. Again, any element that size is a problem. But when we're talking about aluminum, for example, we see the downstream right now absolute epidemic of everything that we would relate to aluminum exposure: dementia, ALS, Alzheimer's, and the list is much longer than that. When you combine these elements, Gary, the toxicity goes through the roof. So we all have mercury in us. We know that from the coal-fired power plants, amalgam fillings, and a lot of other sources. Now we all have aluminum in us, and I mean we all have aluminum in us, period. I don't care who might roll their eyes and not believe that. If you get an accurate hair, blood, or urine test, an accurate test, these metals are absolutely there. So when you combine aluminum and mercury, as just one example we have peer-reviewed study on, the toxicity goes through the roof. Combination of those two metals can increase toxicity by as much as 10,000%. That's 100 times worse. So it's a wonder any of us are walking and talking at this point, but it's wreaking havoc on the environment as well. It's killing soil microbiome. It's killing tree root systems. That's why, Gary, have you noticed every time the wind blows, there's trees tipping over everywhere?
Yeah.
Well, there you go. It's killing the root systems, the root balls back, just the same as it's killing the crowns. And it's destroying the ozone layer. I mean, would it be rational to believe that hairspray cans destroyed the ozone layer, or military tankers dumping 100 tons of
destroying, oxidizing particles, 100 tons per payload. And an annual dispersion based on our precipitation tests of somewhere in the range of 40 to 60 million tons annually. What's the more likely conclusion if both factors we know destroy ozone? Hairspray cans or climate engineering? Obviously, they're using the hairspray cans, which emit a small amount of negative consequence materials, but mathematically speaking, the elephant in the equation is climate engineering on every front, from what we're breathing, the toxic particle matter that air quality boards are not disclosing. And I'll finish on that point. These particles all go into the radar because official air quality testing measures generally PM10, 10 microns, at best 2.5 microns. Those particles are boulders compared to nanoparticles. So this mountain of highly toxic nanoparticle material goes completely under the radar, Gary, by design.
Obviously, if we're seeing the negative effects and, the information is there to study, it would obviously the people that are dispersing these chemicals understand the negative effects. So what do they want to achieve at the cost of people's health, the environmental health? If the guise is to, hey, we want to save the planet and we have to disperse all these particles so that we're reflecting back some of the solar energy, but yet we're damaging the planet. Like, how do they reconcile that? Or even within their own, own testing and things like that, what is it that they think they're going to achieve at the expense of everyone's health and safety and the environment in general?
Okay, first I want to make clear that those in power, those who are truly in power, and that's not any actor in the White House of any party, that's those who print the money. We have selections, not elections. So as far as those in power at the top, they don't give a damn about populations. In fact, populations are a rapidly increasing liability to them. There is no benevolence in these programs at all. They're not trying to save the planet. They're trying to retain their grip on power and control. And again, I would equate this to a cancer. Does a cancer intend to kill its host? No, but cancer intends to proliferate unchecked. Host eventually dies. And that's exactly what we're dealing with. Each part of this cancer pursuing its own personal interest, but as a whole, the ship goes down. We're all on it, including them. No one gets out alive. So as examples we already have, because Gary, I'm sure you've had people will bring this up to you if they haven't already. They'll say, well, I don't believe this because they, ultimately it's those who print the money, wouldn't do this themselves. And I would point out that they already have, and they continue to. We have the detonation of 2,400 nuclear bombs. They didn't ask anybody's permission for that. And they thought that the detonation of hydrogen bombs in the magnetosphere, which they did, Project Starfish Prime and Project Fishbowl, all historical record, they thought it could collapse the atmosphere. Did that stop them? No. And all the other detonations contaminated everything on the planet with nuclear fallout. Everything. In fact, so severely in the U.S., Gary, we have peer-reviewed study to prove now from the Nevada detonations done by our own government that no less than 500,000 Americans died as a result of the fallout, the eventual fallout, the downwinders they're called, and there's peer-reviewed science study to prove that. So again, if we look at the pilots in Vietnam that sprayed Agent Orange all over that country, do we think they were told that, hey, this is going to eventually kill your comrade on the ground? Of course they weren't told. And they believe whatever they were told. Don't worry about this. This is fine. Nothing harmful. I mean, that's business as usual. So again, I would point out that the severity and immediacy of our situation cannot be overstated. We are on an unimaginably short timeline. All of us are going to succumb to these particles. And I'm not denying all the other sources of damage and pollution on the planet. I'm not denying that. I want to make that clear. But in the case of, for example, polymer fibers, which is in our precipitation, and it's named in climate engineering patents specifically. And yes, we have decomposing plastic everywhere, but when these particles are showing up virtually everywhere on planet Earth, North Pole, South Pole, top of Mount Everest, and the particles appear to be of a manufactured uniformity, if you will, then we would relate that to climate engineering. And now we have peer-reviewed study, and your listeners can look this up. Polymer nanoparticles are showing up everywhere in human organs, and they're now realizing this is causing a downstream cascade of every imaginable disease. They're showing up copious quantities in human brains. I could go on and on and on. This is a total ubiquitous contamination of planet Earth.
Now, I know even the last time I had you on when we did our first podcast together, you started talking about how we're going to continue to see additional forest fires and the effects that these particles are having on our vegetation, the desiccant properties that they have. Talk a little bit about that and how this is directly related to what we're seeing. Well, we've been seeing in California for many years, but obviously what's first and foremost in everybody's mind is the LA fires.
Okay, if I can weave my way to the LA fires.
Yeah.
Now, Gary, you've heard certainly the narrative that the fires are burning because we haven't been cutting down enough trees in our forests and blah blah blah. You've heard that narrative, right?
Absolutely.
Okay, and it could not be more false. That is not why the forests are burning. I speak from a background of a father who was an arborist. I've run 6 habitat restoration projects, big projects, 3 state, 3 federal. I'm talking to you right now. What I see in my whole view horizon, every direction, is nothing but wilderness, very rugged wilderness and habitat that I've bled, sweat, and cried in for many years restoring. And I've fought wildland fires in the front lines by hand and in equipment. I've run equipment for many years, and I mean I've watched these changes take place. So the forests are dying across the board, so severely so that there are regions now in the Sierras and the Cascades with about an 80% mortality in the trees. Think about that. That's a stone dead forest. Of course it's going to burn. Has nothing to do with cutting down the trees. And so we have these narratives on both sides of the fence that are patently wrong, and everybody ignoring the elephant in the equation. Climate engineering is killing soil microbiome, killing root systems, thus killing trees from the bottom up, destroyed ozone layers, killing them from the top down, killing the crowns, and causing them to shut their stomata, the respiratory pores. So the forest, there's zero forest smell now, zero here. The trees are not respirating, they're not breathing. None of this addressed by the so-called climate scientists, all of whom are told what to say, told what script to read. I mean, this is a circus of absolute insanity. It's the same as the safe and with the injections that when they're injecting, this is common knowledge for decades, they inject aluminum and mercury into our system and claim it's safe and effective. You can't inject neurotoxins and not get a negative result. And the same is true. You can't fill the skies with toxic, ozone destroying, hydrological cycle disrupting particles and not get a horrible result. And we know from peer-reviewed study, your listeners can look up anything I'm stating. There is not an uncontaminated drop of rain on planet Earth now, anywhere. North Pole, South Pole, top of Mount Everest, not just with climate engineering fallout, but with PFAS forever chemicals. So to the LA fires, we have a U.S. military document we found at geoengineeringwatch.org titled Wildfires as a Military Weapon. 140 pages long. In that document, it describes exactly the kind of preparation over the course of years to dry out a region so that it will burn with unimaginable intensity. That's exactly what has happened in LA. The particles are incendiaries. Aluminum nanoparticles are such an effective incendiary dust that they're used in military demolitions, thermite. So we have a drying out of an area. I don't know if you know this, Gary. LA's had about, I think, 1/10 or 1/4 of an inch of rain since last May. Did you know that?
I didn't know.
I mean, that's nothing, basically.
Right.
They haven't had rain for almost a year. So as named in this military document as well, drying out of an area, coating of the surface with incendiary particles on the wind part. Many people can't fathom that. Who could possibly control the wind? They can absolutely manipulate wind flows. Even if a person pretended that what we see in our skies is just, quote, which it absolutely isn't. Our film footage proves that, our lab tests prove that. But even if we pretend it was, when you can cover the entire horizon with something that emitted from jet aircraft, you have just radically affected wind flow because you're affecting convection, which is the core reason for wind flow. And we know this from wind turbine production. It's completely tanked
they've so disrupted the wind flows that we have all or nothing scenarios. We either have scenarios like the hurricane force winds that just incinerated LA, or we have nothing. And so for a turbine, if you double the wind speed, you get nothing because you have to shut the turbine off to keep it from disintegrating. If you cut the wind speed in half, you get 1/8 the design output. So I'm just getting at the fact that they are definitely affecting wind flows. So with a high pressure dome in LA or north in the northwest that circulates clockwise and circulates that wind down and blows it onto LA, HAARP in Alaska, many of your listeners probably know what HAARP is. HAARP is the acronym. It's an ionosphere heater. And the science isn't disputed. It transmits 3.6 million watts into the electrically charged ionosphere, which causes an electrical chain reaction, superheats it, and causes a heat dome, a high pressure dome in the northern hemisphere. And so we have the wind, we have the dried out region, we have the incendiary dust. Whatever the source of ignition, you're creating a blowtorch effect. And that's exactly what they're doing. Hey, I grew up in Southern California. I grew up at the absolute epicenter kind of winds, but bottom of the Cajon Pass, we never saw anything like this. Nothing.
Now, Dane, you talked about HAARP. That's something that I haven't looked a lot into. I know HAARP was brought up many times when we're talking about the fires out in Maui. If that was responsible for fires in Maui, or possibly, and I know it's been being brought up even now here with the fires in LA. If that is responsible for those fires, how does that work theoretically, or maybe based on some information that you know?
Well, keep in mind, it's not just a this or that. You have all these components involved. And if I get back up to that military document, in that document, they specifically cited 17 locations for study for these type of operations in the lower 48. One of those locations was LA. That document is posted at geoengineeringwatch.org. So in regard to an ionosphere heater, HAARP is only one example. It's the most visible and known example, so we use that often. But you have even larger installations than HAARP. There's two more in other parts of the world, and you have somewhere perhaps even close to 100 smaller installations. You have the NexRad network in the US, which is used to manipulate storms routinely. So frequency transmissions, you have two different types. An ionosphere heater transmits that power into the atmosphere. Ionosphere, again, electrically charged, has one effect of creating atmospheric pressure zones. The ground-based transmitting units, and we've captured all this in real time. The interaction, for example, with hurricanes like Helene, the steering of those storms. We can speculate on the agendas and objectives, but those storms were steered and we captured it while it was happening. I'm surprised we have access to the data loops that show the transmissions and their interactions with the storms, but we do at the moment still. So that frequency transmission has a repelling effect on the air mass. Thus, they can push that storm in various directions depending on how they energize the network. So on situations like Lahaina, we also have what's called SBX radar, sea-based X-band radar. Your listeners can look that up. It looks like a giant golf ball on an oil derrick.
Say that again. Say that again for me, Dane, because as you're talking about some of these things, I'm actually looking them up and I'm showing them to the viewers as you're speaking. So that was the SBX?
SBX radar. That's a weapon of mass destruction, just like HAARP, just like the rest. Again, the term quiet weapons for silent wars, I think, is the term that, there's documents that talk about these types of operations. So even many of those involved with some of the parts of these operations may not know exactly what they're a part of. I mean, everything's compartmentalized. So for Lahaina, you had what was recognized by the meteorological community as an extremely anomalous high pressure zone to the north, which rotates clockwise in the northern hemisphere. You had a very anomalous low pressure storm, Hurricane Dora, to the south, which had an almost record length track and raised eyebrows in the meteorological community as well. That rotates counterclockwise. So between the two, you had Maui and Lahaina. And so even though you're not in the direct wind field of either pressure zone, you do create a wind tunnel in the middle, and that's what they did. So in Lahaina, 1 week before those fires was declared a, quote, flash drought zone. A tropical island with flash drought. I mean, we need to connect the dots. And if I could, let me give a historical example, Gary, that might hit home more.
Sure.
Do you remember after 9/11, General Wesley Clark, the former NATO Supreme Commander, was given a list of countries to be targeted after 9/11?
Yep.
So every one of those countries subsequently underwent a once in 1,000 year drought. Statistically, mathematically, to have that kind of coincidence is impossible without some kind of intervention. And we had, again, the leaders of those countries on the floor of the UN in Iran, specifically on film, on the record, stating NATO's cutting off our precipitation. When you cut off the rain, you decimate the food supply, you destabilize the country. And so we have these military examples. In Vietnam, Project Popeye, U.S. was so successful at creating precipitation over Vietnam that they passed international treaties in the 70s forbidding weather manipulation. Not that anybody pays attention to them. So people should wonder this: if our military is so successful at creating precipitation, we don't think they could have stopped Lahaina from happening in the first place, or LA? If they were so successful in the 60s that they couldn't do exponentially more now, but in fact, they're cutting off the precipitation. And for our military brothers and sisters participating, I would argue we need to wake them the hell up. And following orders blindly is not okay. They took an oath to protect their citizens from all threats, foreign and domestic. Those who are running the show are the ones who ultimately at the top, the ones who print the money. That's who runs the show.
Well, and I think when it comes to, for instance, I think a lot of the stuff ends up being so compartmentalized that most people don't even realize what they're participating in to begin with. I think that's one of the biggest challenges because, for instance, if you have, let's say these pilots that are out there, dispersing these chemicals and creating these chemtrails to begin with, chances are most of those are, God-fearing, red-blooded Americans that love this country. But, who knows what they're told that those actually do, or what they're for, what the efficacy and safety of those products are. I mean, just like, we saw so many doctors that have recently come out after what we saw with COVID saying, hey, you know what? I now believe mRNA vaccines, X, Y, and Z, fill in the blank, whatever that is. I now believe that, ivermectin and some of these other different therapeutic drugs that are actually safe and effective. These were doctors that were speaking for the mRNA, saying it was safe, it was effective, it was great, it stopped COVID in its tracks. And then we had all these other people, same doctors also saying, hey, you know what? You want to stay away from these horse pills and this horse medicine and whatever else. And now they've completely changed their tune. And I think that's what we see with the military. And I'm sure, just like you talked about with the Vietnam example, talking about Agent Orange, I'm sure these pilots and the people that were participating in that program had no idea. And who knows what they're told? Like if they ask questions, hey, is this safe for us? So I think that is the challenge. And that is the challenge with a lot of these, where there is real conspiracy. It's right under everybody's nose and they don't even realize they're participating in it. And I think that's one of the bigger challenges out there.
I would fully agree. I fully agree with you, but those that have so far just kept their heads down and done what they're told need to start showing some courage and responsibility toward the whole. From my perspective, there's no excuse for any medical professional not to know that injecting mercury and aluminum will do harm. It can't not do harm. And yet they all participated, because to do otherwise would be to sacrifice their paychecks, their pensions, their personal paradigms. And too few are willing to put their honor above everything else. Our honor is the only thing we own. And in this case, the consequences of remaining on this course are total. I want to stress that. If we remain on this course, at best, even if we completely alter our course, we will very soon face challenges that few can imagine. Mathematically, statistically, if we remain on this course, we are not going to be here much long. And I mean nobody, and I mean not very long at all. Let me put that into mathematical perspective. We've already lost 80 to 90% of global insect populations, terrestrial and aquatic, 80 to 90%. Bird populations are crashing because of that. Earthworm populations crashing, wildlife populations crashing down very conservatively, down 74% in the last 40 years alone. And that was already from a declined population. We have caribou herds in the Arctic that have gone from over 1 million to 2,000 or 3,000. That's a total collapse. Fisheries populations around the globe, not going to be eating fish very long, not that you want to right now, because all of it is contaminated. But global pelagic fish populations down 90%. We're talking about Mad Max in the extreme near future. And on the wild caught fish in the U.S., we have a peer-reviewed study on that. 500 locations. If you eat one wild caught fish in the U.S., because again the precipitation is toxic, which means the runoff is toxic, which means the fish are toxic. Eating one wild caught fish in the U.S. is equivalent, the study concluded, to drinking a month's worth of tainted water. Think about that.
And I will tell you, I know there's some folks in the comments that are skeptical, and I want you to be skeptical. And that's one of the things that we talk about on this podcast on a regular basis. I don't want you to take my word for it, or anybody else's word for it. But I will tell you, I went down this rabbit hole after, being introduced to the original documentary, The Deming, and I went through, and I have everything on Dane's website. Geoengineeringwatch.org. Go through there, and I want you to start researching some of the stuff. And then again, as we're going through this, I'm pulling up some of the information, kind of fact checking Dane as we go. And I got to tell you, folks, I have been shocked by this. I was absolutely skeptical as well. And I'm telling you right now, I think there's a lot of evidence that indicates that everything so far that I've heard from Dane that set my radar off a little bit, like, ooh, that sounds a little odd. I would go and I would research it, and man, it just makes you realize what you don't know.
If you got some skeptical questions in the chat, I embrace that. I welcome that. The more skeptical, the better. Please fire away, because I will give you an answer.
No, and what we're going to do, folks, we are going to open up the in just a little bit. We'll give it a few more minutes. I'm going through, and if you have questions for Dane, definitely hit those. I'm highlighting some of those as we go along. But we will open it up in just a few minutes and open it up to some questions. But if you have one, you don't want to forget it. Again, I am. You can list it now, and then I'll highlight it, and I'll go back to it as well. So keep that in mind, and keep your questions on hand. So, we have this spraying that's taking place. They're manipulating weather through different avenues and mechanisms as well. So what is the primary goal here? Is it just that they want to be able to use weapon for warfare? What is ultimately worth destroying the planet and destroying our population and destroying our ability to grow food? I mean, like, what is the end state?
This is where, again, it's complicated, but I'll try to simplify it as much as I can.
Sure.
Let me start with it. For your listeners that don't know who Zbigniew Brzezinski is, he was the advisor to U.S. President from Johnson in the 60s all the way up to 2017. So this advisor to U.S. presidents, a very core advisor, has stated on the record, your listeners can look this up, that with today's technology, it's far easier to kill 1 million people than to control them. It's no secret that those at the top of the power structure, the global elite, have long since desired to thin the herd radically, because the current paradigm, and this is where no one wants to accept this, we cannot live this way on a finite planet with finite resources. We can't. And I'm no Al Gore fan. Al Gore's a criminal. AOC is completely, I could throw a lot of descriptive words out for her. And the environmental groups, all of them, geoengineeringwatch.org attorneys have spoken to the heads of environmental groups, all the main ones, Sierra Club, Greenpeace, WWF, all of them. They won't touch this issue because they don't want to lose their 501 nonprofit. That's criminal hypocrisy. So I'm not in those crowds, but I'm saying that obviously we can't live this way with looting, pillaging, plundering, and polluting the planet until nothing is left. Those in power know this. They should know it because they're the most responsible for it, the most for setting up this paradigm. they're not about to let go of that power, even if it kills everyone in the process. What Sun Tzu said, that some would burn everything to the ground so they can rule over the ashes. And that's the mentality we're dealing with. We literally are dealing with that mentality. Psychoanalysis of those in power, and this is straight from the manual. I've dug deep on every aspect of this. The common profile for those in power is this: a near total lack of comprehension as to the consequences of their actions, even to themselves. We're dealing with power addicts. Do addicts care the next fix may kill them? They don't care. They're not going to let go of their power, period. So they look at this, to answer your question, Gary, as a, quote, risk to risk scenario. The risk of doing it versus the risk of not doing it. This is not about the greater good. And what they're trying to preserve is not the public good, but their power, period. Even if it kills everyone and everything in the process, they're trying to preserve the status quo until the last second, until the moment of impact. They're trying to, and they've done very well at this, they're trying to program populations for normalcy bias. Hey, what could be wrong? How could things be this bad? Because Walmart's still open, right? We still buy a Big Mac.
Right.
It couldn't be that bad, right? And they entertain, I mean, the political theater is truly mind-numbing while the planet's literally going down in flames or deluging. And I mean, we face completely broken planetary systems right now. So again, ultimately, this is a way to try to mask the severity of damage done to the planet. And they're doing that right now with the major chemical ice nucleation cool down, chemical ice nucleation cloud seeding, which is basically chemically engineering winter weather, a cold air at the surface. And again, that's starting to unfold right now. They have a major event planned for the lower 48, while Alaska is a record shattering high, 10 degrees above the former records, not 10 degrees above normal, but 10 degrees, breaking records by 10 degrees, which is like 40, 50 degrees above normal. Nobody talks about that. They just talk about that it's going to snow in New Orleans. And so people believe that. Well, how could there be any warming? Look, it's chemically snowing in New Orleans. So by all these means, they're able to completely bamboozle populations, feed normalcy bias, and keep business as usual until everything collapses. And that's what the climate conferences are about, by the way. I'll finish with this. The global climate conferences like the COP conferences that just happened, one in Dubai, one in Azerbaijan, those are total smoke and mirrors farces in oil countries designed to force other countries to actively or passively participate in climate engineering behind closed doors. That's what it's about.
Well, and I think they've definitely, when we're talking about covert operations, we always talk about, cover for action and cover for, really what we're talking about is cover for action. And in the climate change narrative is the perfect cover for all of this. They could be manipulating weather, they could be doing things that are harmful to us, and it's just really easy, like, well, it's climate change. And I've always, look, I still feel like climate change, whether we're talking about artificial or the term that we know it as to be, is always been used for something that it's being used to manipulate people one way or the other. And it has always bothered me. I've always seen an issue with the supposed solutions that have always seemed to have a leftist socialist lean on things, where they are using this as an excuse to push certain policies, take away your freedom, all of those things. And just like I talked to you yesterday, or maybe it was prior to the show, we were talking about, I think it's really important, the fact that people are aware of this, so that they can be prepared for this, right? Just like you're doing right now. And I was talking to you prior to the show, you're kind of a specialist in energy independence and what you have done with your home and everything else. We definitely need to have a podcast on that. I'd love to talk about how people can become more energy independent through, whether it's solar, through electrical systems and battery systems, generator, whatever works. But just being able to being prepared for when bad things do occur, because it sure seems like we're seeing a increase in storms, in definitely storms that are falling on land and affecting people in different ways, whether we're talking about LA right now, or we're talking about Hurricane Helene, we're talking about Maui, all those things. Like, people have got to be prepared, and that's what this channel is all about. That's what everything we do at Paramount's all about. And I think it's just important to have the information so that you guys can decide and figure out what's true, and you guys can do your own research. You know, one thing that I've seen in all of Dane's content, many times he say, hey, look, don't believe me, go research it. And so far, like I said, everything that I've tried to take him into task on, I found that there's more truth behind it than I'm comfortable with, to say the least. Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about somebody up here. Let me see if I have this comment, because it was a good one. B22 said, I believe everything your guest is talking about, but I don't think this is what started the fires here in LA. That's all. You know, he had said something that basically he's like, this sounds a little conspiracy theory-ish. I think he said QAnon-ish. And that was my remark to, like, hey, look, I want everybody to be skeptical. But said, I believe everything your guest is talking about, but I don't think it's what started the fires here in LA. So address that.
Did I say?
No, you did. You didn't. No, I if anything, I tied it into what's going on with LA. And I think regardless of what started it, there's conditions being laid down that make these fires a lot harder to control. I think that's at least my point. I don't know how you feel about it.
Yeah, that is indisputable. What is setting the template? What is creating the conditions for these fires to burn with such ferocity? Any moron with a match can start a fire.
Sure.
So we could speculate on that. They could find 100 different idiots to go out and start a fire, no question. But we do have a factor, which I think you and I touched on off the air. There has to be another factor that's contributing to the uniformity of these burns, which means when the wind's fanning these flames through neighborhoods, the burns are so uniform, almost nothing is missed. There has to be a factor contributing to that. It appears to us, based on available data, that the most likely piece of the puzzle in that question is smart meters. Smart meters are very capable of igniting fires. They already have done so. There's lawsuits because of it. When we know that, and your listeners I'm sure know about the pagers and smartphones that detonated in Syria, and how the technology that did that would be easily applied to smart meters, even much more easily. It's a much bigger unit. It can contain capacitors which retain a charge even if the grid goes down. They're very capable of igniting a slow burn that would then eventually encompass the house. To back this up, the Carr fire, very destructive fire in Northern California, where I think the world's largest fire tornado was recorded. And an owner there in an affluent neighborhood that burnt to the ground tracked me down, showed me pictures. They were the last ones to leave the evacuated neighborhood of, again, large affluent houses. And as they were leaving near dusk, they saw flickering in their neighbor's home. They went to the door, took pictures through the window. Their neighbor's home was already ablaze inside. The fire hadn't even reached the neighborhood yet. What's wrong with this picture? And now we see in the Palisades, we've seen houses with flames pouring out the windows. There's no fire at the perimeter yet.
Right. There's
something very wrong here. And for those who think, again, for anybody who thinks that those in power wouldn't do this, think again. Think again. They know this paradigm is over. COVID wasn't just some mistake. Oops, we engineered a virus and now it's infected everybody. And now we have this mRNA vaccine and we don't know what the ticking time bomb is there. If there were prions in some of those injections, and for those, we talked about prions off the air, I think,
yep.
Or other similar elements, these are ticking time bombs injected in 80% of the population now. They are trying to cull the herd as fast as they can. Anyone who thinks they wouldn't carry out, LA is so blatant. It is such a blatant weather warfare attack period. Source of ignition, different subject. And there's all kinds of internet absolute nonsense claims of every description. That's not us. What we're saying is we have absolute indisputable proof. Climate engineering operations are setting the template for these blazes. They are behind the blowtorch winds that are incinerating these regions. This is absolute proven technology. And
there appears to be other elements that, again, we don't claim to be able to prove, although we have images of a structure with flames pouring out the inside, no fire around the perimeter, nothing on the roof, tile roof. Something's wrong. Something's wrong. And the person that showed me these pictures, they were afraid to do anything with them because they have some knowledge of how severe the punishment might be by those in power for anybody who might have that kind of proof. We've had pilots contact us at geoengineeringwatch.org, Gary. It's happened twice. That left us urgent messages. It took us about 8 to 10 hours in each case to get back with those pilots. One was maybe a tailhook pilot, said that they were tried to bring information in these programs into a congressional committee, and they felt like they were going lines in. Could we call them, please? And they left names, and by the time we got back hours later, everything disconnected. And I contacted a close friend, Kevin Shipp. I don't know if you know who Kevin is. He's former CIA. He's pretty well known. He wrote a book from the Company of Shadows because they tried to harm him and his family for him trying to blow the whistle. So I contacted Kevin, passed on these names to him, and he said these people are exactly who they said they were. Nothing from them. And people that think, and we hear this also we hear it from pilots, just like you hear from doctors, that if these vaccines were harmful, there would be whistleblowers everywhere. Really? Really? Who blew the whistle in the torture programs? John Carrico, U.S. official. John Carrico, who's the only one to go to jail for the illegal torture. John Carrico. We have an illegal federal gag order. Your listeners should legal federal gag order right now on all National Weather Service and all National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration weather personnel. If that isn't a massive red flag, what isn't? We know what happens to whistleblowers. So I'm saying that these issues will come to light. There's a dozen new articles a day from science sources around the globe saying we need to put jets in the air to spray particles to cool the planet. But that's not what you're seeing. What? I mean, we live in an asylum, at this point. But bottom line is source of ignition, separate subject. But what's setting the template for these fires to burn with such ferocity? What's blowtorching this fire through neighborhoods? Climate engineering.
Yeah, I mean, again, folks, like I said, what we want to do is present information for you or to you. And, you do the research and you figure out what you believe after it's all said and done. But I think we'd be remiss not to bring this up. My mind's totally changed on all this. I'll just be honest with you. That's where I am. I'm still always skeptical. But the more you look into this, the more evidence there is, both like real good hard evidence, and then of course a lot of it is going to be circumstantial as we look at some of these things. And I think Jeff Johnson brought up the fact that talking about even things like the Popeye program in Vietnam, it's kind of hard to say, hey, did it rain because we did all this weather manipulation, or did it just happen to rain? And some of those things are true. It is tough to tie correlation with causation. That is going to be a challenge. But here's what I'll tell you. If you start, number one thing that everyone please do, watch the dimming. Because when you go through and you look at all the different patents that the U.S. government has filed for weather manipulation, and clearly they've spent millions and millions of dollars trying to procure equipment, develop equipment, and develop programs for this. So that doesn't tell me that that tells me that they feel pretty confident in their abilities to pull off some of these, because they wouldn't continue to study this and spend money on it and create patents for these products. Everything from, again, he talked about the aerosols, the different chemical compounds are used to manipulate weather, as well as the delivery systems themselves. Like, if they're taking, and again, even at the beginning of that video, you guys saw some of the patents they had with large aircraft. They're not going to spend the millions and millions of dollars outfitting these large aircraft with these delivery systems if they weren't getting some juice for their squeeze. I mean, that's just, they're definitely getting an ROI. And the question is, how far have they become? And I think most people generally, if you just think about it for a minute, I think most people, even as I look in the comments over here, I think most people generally think that we can manipulate the weather to some extent. The question is, how much? And I would say that whatever we think we know, if they've been spending a lot of time, money, and effort developing these programs, chances are they're able to manipulated at a higher degree than what we're aware of or what we even think is capable. So
if I could elaborate on that when you're done, go ahead.
No, go ahead. I was done. Send it.
Well, to dovetail on what you just said, it is truly perplexing to us. geoengineering.org, the vast majority do believe that the publicized, well-known weather modification operations in states all across the country, which is a single engine, propeller-driven aircraft with a few flares on the wings that might distribute 10 or 12 kilos into the clouds. They believe that can manipulate the weather, but somehow they can't seem to accept that fleets of military tankers dumping 100 tons per payload. That's what a KC-135 can carry, 100 tons in one payload. Somehow that doesn't exist. Our government wouldn't do that without our permission, which is, again, it's perplexing that they can't cross that bridge, if you will. Let's give a couple of other examples of what we could call coincidence. So Dubai, Gary, do you remember Dubai just got hit with 2 years of rain in 6 hours? Remember that?
I did. Yeah, I do remember seeing that.
Okay, so what happened 5 or 6 days before that? Dubai basically announced they're going to ditch the dollar. Just a coincidence that they got annihilated with unprecedented flooding, 2 years worth of rain in 6 hours. Just a coincidence? Let's look at Spain. Did you see pictures of Valencia, Spain?
I did not.
After that, it's for your listeners. It's worth looking at. It's worth looking at Valencia, Spain. You have to see it to believe it. I mean, it looks like some kind of a CGI image, apocalyptic movie.
What happened? I'm searching that right now. What happened in Valencia, Spain?
They got hit with about 2 years worth of rain in a few hours as well. And I mean, it literally the cars were piled up several stories high in the streets between the buildings. I mean, you have to see it to believe it. What happened there? Spain was very vocally criticizing U.S. and its allies' Middle Eastern policies right before that happened. What happened in Mexico? Have you seen photographs of Acapulco? Acapulco, for your listeners who don't know, Acapulco. Did you see that?
Yeah, I did. Yes.
Acapulco's done. It's never coming back. So what happened in Acapulco? Mexico was pushing back against some of the Western power policies as well. So what happened there? Hurricane Otis was initially in 24 hours. It wasn't a hurricane. It was a very insignificant low pressure tropical storm. In less than 24 hours, it spun up to the strongest Cat 5 cyclone to ever hit that part of the world and completely annihilated Acapulco. It's done. It's not coming back. We have to see a flyby of the post-storm, and you have to see it to believe it. These are not coincidences. They have this power. And one of the voices you heard when you rolled the first few minutes of the dimming was General Rich Rolig, 2-star U.S. Air Force general, stating that it's ridiculous to think that this weapon wouldn't be used. Of course it's being used. Of course it is. And so again, I know this is very, I don't want to believe any of this. I want to believe that I am completely wrong and have been about everything. But that's not the case. And if anybody looks back at my data, my disseminations going back a decade and a half, everything I said would happen has happened, because I wasn't looking into a crystal ball. I wasn't speculating or theorizing. I was looking at data. And what I presented to Governor Gavin Newsom in his office, a personal meeting arranged by some important people, because they wanted him to understand this issue. And he's a tool for the power structure. That guy
I think you could have stopped it. He's a tool, but I agree.
You understand. I mean, that they don't come any worthless than him, but I presented to Gavin for about 45 minutes in his top aide, and he couldn't dispute what I said. He pushed himself back in his chair at one point and said, I didn't need this. And that's as far as it got. And I had a heated exchange email-wise with him after, and that's the last I ever heard from him. Of course, I've been in Barbara Boxer's office. I've met with Northern California Congressman. In fact, Northern California Congressman Doug Lamoff, I had about a half a dozen meetings with him. His staff used to call me at home on the weekends because they were so distraught about these operations that were wiping out our state. And the last message I got from his staff was, we were told to shut up about this issue. And that's it. Done. Chuck Norris. I had communications with Chuck and his wife, Gina. I did 3 articles working with Chuck, and they were on WND. outlet, online site. His pastor came to Reading to meet with me personally. They were going to stick by me. We have a mutual close friend I have with Chuck, and he was told to shut the hell up. That's it. Done. Had 3 hours with Merle Haggard. You remember Merle?
Oh, yeah.
He was probably.
Oh, yeah.
And Merle was going to get, I had a lot of meetings with Merle, and him and Willie were going to put something together to put this issue on the radar. And that got the boot put over it. And then Merle, and he wasn't in good health. I'm not implying anything nefarious, but he died shortly after. That was the end of that. So again, it's not hard for those in power to put a boot over any fire. Yeah, it was. But again, I want to express the gravity. If we could expose this issue, if we could push it to the full light of day, the fur will fly. Everybody everywhere will know and have to face the fact that this evil, this core of cancer that's truly controlling things, intends to level the playing field. And this is real. It's real, and it's now.
Yeah, I'm just kind of thinking through some things as you're talking. And when we talk about if we have the ability to control weather the way that we do, that also gives us a lot of plausible deniability if we want to, attack certain countries or, like you said, impose or take people off of or punish them for opposition. And again, whether it's Acapulco, whether it's Spain, whatever we got going on, if what you're saying is true, and I could understand the U.S. government or any government for that matter wanting the ability to decimate specific areas they would want to without the use of obvious force, right? And I think that makes perfect sense from a strategic weapon standpoint. I mean, that's just impossible to deny. I'm way behind on questions, folks. I am highlighting them as we go along. We'll try to throw some more in here and catch up on these. George Koo says, looks like scientists understand the nature of the problem and may have a solution. Do governments take action? If not, what's the main issue? Lack of awareness, resources, or political will? So I guess his question is, hey, there's people out there that are aware of this. And I guess he's asking the same thing that I think a lot of us are asking, what can they do? What should they be doing? But ultimately, what can we do as a population?
Population needs us to help start spot fires of awareness to provide enough cover for the so far cowardly legions in academia to find their spine and start telling the truth. And we know that's the case. I've been in the field with USDA scientists that I knew then well because of the habitat restoration projects that I ran personally in the field, and testing soil pH values. And to give an idea of how much contamination has fallen on us here in Northern California, so much contamination in the rain that it has altered our soil pH values 10 times toward alkaline. And I know this because I have the historical USDA I got from a contact I have in USDA I have the original baselines from the 40s. Soil pH values here, they're normally acidic soils, 5.6 range, 5.5, 5.6. Now they're 6.5, 6.6. 1 point on that scale is a magnitude of 10. In the field testing with USDA scientists, CAL FIRE scientists, whom I know, they know this is going on. They sheepishly look at me and say, what do you want us to do about it? We don't want to lose our jobs. Your job's not going to mean anything. Hiding in your cabin on the Titanic is not going to save you. University of Minnesota, work with PhDs there. They've done a lot of testing for us. We've paid thousands of dollars for that testing at geoengineeringwatch.org. And one of those tests, by the way, I'll just interject this. Have you seen trees? I think we talked about this offline, Gary. Trees that are fully foliated with stone dead leaves, deciduous trees. As you go into the fall, they're just dead leaves hanging all over those trees.
I'm sure I have. I don't know that I have in the past paid that much attention to that aspect of things. That's for sure.
I would take notice of it because I'm going to lead this into what I have academicians standing by. So that is not nature. So we have that here in Northern California. It was known for trees. And you have whole rows of deciduous trees right now, stone dead leaves hanging on them. And they'll hang there all winter if they're in a sheltered location. The wind doesn't blow them off. That's not nature. That's a synthesized plant hormone defoliant. And we know because in thousands of dollars worth of testing with UC Minnesota, we proved it. And they were supposed to provide me a published study on that. But their PhDs that did this became afraid of losing grants, and they absolutely tucked tail and ran. And we've seen this over and over and over again. It's human nature. Nobody wants to disturb their personal paradigm, even if the future of their posterity depends on it. Courage and honor is in damn short supply, and that better change or we're done. So think about that. On top of everything I already named, we know there's a chemical plant hormonal synthesized defoliant. This is not like dioxin. It's not Agent Orange. It would kill everything. Very specialized defoliant, which the farmers, by the way, are using in the California Central Valley to force their trees into dormancy because it's not cold enough anymore for that to happen. We have leaves right now. We have some trees that weren't exposed to rain here in Northern California, direct precipitation. They're still fully foliated with their leaves from last year. They haven't fallen off. We haven't had a single freeze run out here, Gary. Not one. This in Northern California. So they're dead. And again, we're the ones we've been waiting for. We are the ones we've been waiting for. It's up to us and everybody who can find the basic building blocks of this issue. Don't make it complicated, and don't run out in the street and point at the sky and start ranting. Pass on credible data. And we offer that at geoengineeringwatch.org. And by the way, at less than our cost. I'm not selling anything that we gain from. We're losing money on our printed materials. I've sacrificed my SEP IRA account. I sold off an extensive amount of resources to keep this battle going because it's not going to matter. I'm not going to need those resources, but we pass on our printed materials, which are very effective tools to wake others up at less than our cost.
You know, Dane, at the beginning in your bio, and you've talked about it too, where you kind of got started with this, and correct me if I get any of this wrong, but where you kind of got started with this is that, you know, you had your entire home being powered by solar energy, and then suddenly you saw a very rapid decrease in the ability to collect solar energy. Can you kind of just explain to everybody like how you experienced that, how you quantified that, and you know, if that was like the starting point of all of this for you, and when did that take place exactly?
That was in 2002, and yes, you're completely correct. That's what started me on this road, because I had heard about, quote, chemtrails, and we avoid that term like the plague now, but I'd heard about it, and my response was exactly what yours was. Rolled my eyes. I thought, well, my background, I would have heard about this is nonsense. So when I began to lose 50, 60% of my solar PV uptake from strictly what these aircraft were emitting, you can see it. That's where it's coming from. Blue sky that turns into this opaque, filthy looking sky. It's all from the jets. We have time-lapse footage to prove it, to show it. And that blocks, it's not blocking 70 or 80% of visible light.
Well, let me just let me interrupt you for a minute, because I got to be honest with you. Since our last discussion, now every time I look up at the sky and I see these, it's like, you son of a bitches. Like, you never look at the sky the same way. And you're absolutely right. Like, you know, it is whatever they're emitting stays in the air for a really long time. It takes a really long time for it to disperse, and then it just blankets everything. It's completely artificial. I guess that's my point. And ever since, you know, our first discussion, I've just never looked at the skies and planes overhead the same way. But I just wanted to throw that in there. And I'm sorry to interrupt.
No, thank you for saying that, because I walk through the forest here cussing like a sailor while I look up. And what rational person wouldn't feel that way? The very air you need to breathe is being tainted with this, and it's just blocking the sun, which we need for everything. And to elaborate on the solar part and the people in other arenas that are behaving with no honor, no courage. So this blocking of direct sunlight, which is affecting all three primary forms of alternative energy: wind, hydro, and solar. And for listeners, they know I have all three forms here: wind, hydro, and solar. So yes, it was blocking enough direct sunlight to reduce my solar PV output from sometimes 60 or 70%. on some days. And so I began to research the subject of climate engineering, geoengineering, was shocked at how much data was there that I hadn't heard of.
Yeah.
Looked for the primary elements named in the patent, starting with aluminum. Started to do my first precipitation tests. I hoped, I prayed, I would not find it. And I did. And the initial test of 7 ppb, 7 parts per billion, which was, I talked to a state hydrogeologist to confirm that that was definitely not normal, given my filtered forested location. There's no industry anywhere west of me, anywhere around me, period. I continued testing over the next 18 months. I had precipitations as high as 3,450 parts per billion of aluminum. That is toxic rain. What was I to do? What was I to do? I wanted to work in the forest because I my whole life worked toward getting here to this place. And again, I'm looking right out a window right now, and it's wilderness as far as you can see. I wanted to live here alone in solitude and work restoring the forest, restoring it from horrible logging practices that happened here in years past. I just wanted to live there in solitude and bleed and sweat in the forest. And this effort of love of my, of habitat. How could I stay there? Why would I stay there? If I knew the whole forest was going to die, if this continued, what point would there be in me staying there? I never wanted this job. It's the last thing I wanted to spend the last 20 plus years of my life doing. But how can I look myself in the mirror and my kids in the eye without doing this?
Yeah. I mean, that's, I don't know. Like I said, every time I hear you talk and you start presenting things, I just find myself slack-jawed and like, how did I not know this stuff? It is pretty crazy. And folks, a couple of questions I just saw. Number one, Garan Thacker says, please ask Dane how we can donate to the work he does. Folks, if you go to geoengineeringwatch.org, lots of information there, lots of different resources. You can find all that information there. And folks, all you gotta do is click on the title of this live stream, and down there in the description, lots of different links. But definitely go to geowatch.org. If you feel inclined to donate and help, please do. But again, there's also a lot of resources there that you can go through there and check out. Also his YouTube channel. He has a great YouTube channel. Go there. That is Dane. It's just your name, right? For your YouTube channel. I have it linked down below in the description as well. Just Dane Wigington. YouTube channel.
Yeah.
Yep. So go check that out. I'm looking.
So this is what we've done to try to get the word out. What have I done to try to get the word out? One, I've never accepted a sponsorship from anybody. I'm not going to ruin. We pay for out of pocket. We have paid for radio stations across the country for over 10 years. At some points, we had 28 stations, Salem Media, Stevens Media, all paid for 100% out of pocket. At times, 27, 28K a month out of pocket, no sponsorship. We specifically pick stations near military bases to wake up our military brothers and sisters to what they're participating in. We tried to reach the non-choir, and we've flyered newspapers at the cost into 6 figures, flyering newspapers in California. And this shows the apathy. Some of these towns that have burnt to the ground, Gary, like in Santa Rosa and some of those places, we paid for individual paper with 100,000 circulation. It might cost us, between the cost of the flyers and paying the paper to put them in, there may be a cost in that one, in a single instance, of 15K. And so these regions, before the fires hit, were given notice of this. And it's like, I mean, people so don't want to face the truth that even if their house burns down, they still won't face this horrific reality. And my point is, if we're standing in the middle of the freeway in rush hour, should we turn our back to traffic and hope for the best? Or should we face it and try to dodge the oncoming semi, or do what we can? And I would argue a life lived turning your back to the oncoming train is not a life well lived. It's our responsibility to face this issue. And we look at spiritual institutions, and I've talked to the heads of many of the large spiritual institutions in Northern California. There's a bunch in the pastures. The first thing they say to me, We don't need to worry about this. It's in God's hands. Whoa, wait a minute. Wait a minute. Scripture doesn't say you can do that.
Yeah.
It says, before you knew your sins were washed away, now you know your sins remain. Where does it say you can turn your back to this? And I shame them into taking the data, but then I know they hide it. And too many in the congregations are willing to allow their pastors to hide behind their pulpit to protect their 501 nonprofit. And that's exactly what they're doing. And that's not okay either. Environmental groups to the churches, their leaders, all doing the same thing, protecting their nonprofit.
Yeah, and you know, just like us, I think a lot of people get very myopic in what they can focus on and what they do focus on. And, you know, there's lots of different groups out there, whether they be environmental groups, whether they be churches or whatever else. You know, we get sucked into our little, I don't know, subject matter expertise. I know I do. And this is one of the things that, you know, I had heard about chemtrails. I never researched it until somebody sent me some stuff on it. And I did that very begrudgingly. And then, you know, you're watching the Deming, you present so much information, so much evidence. It's just really hard to deny that it's happening now. You know, and then not only that, all the testing that you present within that, like, hey, this is what's going on. And by the way, this is what the test results are. And the test results that when we see this is the effects of those test results. This is the effect of those chemicals in your system, in the environment. I mean, you guys, you did a really, really good job with that. And it's just, again, folks, if you're skeptical, just go watch that. And, you know, go from there, because that's where I'm at on this ride. But yes, going back to also what you said, as far as, you know, we'll just kind of put it in God's hand and he's going to take care of it. Like, you know, again, just like you said, I don't think that's biblical. But on top of that, is that how we're going to approach self-defense? If somebody, we're not going to carry firearms, we're not going to carry a spare tire in our vehicle. And, you know, if we slide off the road in a snowstorm and freeze to death because we can't put a new tire on or whatever it is, right? Like, that's a stupid way to approach anything. And that is not biblical. That doesn't even make sense. You know, quit your job and don't pay your bills and just let God handle that. Like, God expects some things out of you to take responsibility for the knowledge that he provides you, to go out there and do something about it, to protect yourself, protect your family, all those things. I think that's a silly, non-biblical approach. And it's just one thing that Amy asked earlier. I'm going to bring this up. She said, if you have time, can you ask about the mysterious fog? I've seen this on X. I don't know about it. There was a lot of information going on with some fog that people were testing. I was scared to even go down that rabbit hole. Do you know what she's referencing, Dane?
I absolutely do. And the fog is a direct result of patented processes of chemical ice nucleation cloud seeding operations. You have a surface temperature gradient that's warming rapidly. They are desperately trying to mask that. They're seeding everything, every bit of moisture in this state. They're seeding the hell out of chemical ice nucleation, creates a cold, dense layer of air that descends to the surface. Cold air is dense. That's why when you walk in your market, Gary, and you have an open freezer, no top on it at all, but everything in that basin is frozen because that cold air sits in that basin. And that's exactly what they're doing. They're being so aggressive with chemical nucleation right now, and they have big plans for the next week plus to radically cool down the U.S. Again, this is a surface cold. I want to stress that. They've taken the temperature gauges out of a lot of airlines because they don't want passengers to see when you go 1,000 foot off the deck, the temperatures go up 30 degrees. That's wrong. That's wrong. They're trying to mask this so that the chemical nucleation process has created a lot of cold fog zones. And there are toxic elements in that fog. A lot of people got sick in that. And these are elements that we know are there. There's likely much more that we don't know is there. And when you fill the atmosphere with these kind of particles, those are at absolute minimum. Not only are the elements toxic, but at minimum, those are very effective platforms for fungal proliferation. So now we have fungus going off the scale in everything, in the environment and in us, because many human ailments are connected to fungal everything. Mainstream medicine doesn't acknowledge that. So, and these are highly inflammatory particles. So at minimum, this is causing a downstream cascading
cases of every form of human ailment. So yeah, the fog is directly related to climate engineering, period. So again, so many roads lead back to this. And if I could, on one more final note of bad news here in climate engineering, we can even tie this into nuclear cataclysm, because what they're doing to the atmosphere has so compromised the atmosphere, and we're meeting UV on the surface, by the way. We're getting UVC in the surface. So let's pretend for a moment, Gary, we have no other challenge. Everything's fine on planet Earth except the ozone layer. So we had a former NASA contract engineer. He recently passed away as well a few months ago, but he had state-of-the-art equipment, probably the most capable individual on the planet of doing what he was doing. It's what he did for the government before. And we're down to about 30% of the ozone layer remaining. Not 30% gone, but 30% remaining. That's why the sun feels so intense. It's not your imagination. You're not getting older or more susceptible. We're getting UVC in the surface. So for UV, you have UVA at the top of the spectrum, UVB, UVC, and then X-ray. We're told 95% of incoming UV radiation is UVA, 5% UVB, no UVC, and certainly no X-ray. We're getting significant quantities of UVC in the surface. That's a DNA damaging spectrum. It's killing insects. It's burning tree foliage. It's making cars heat up really fast. Gary, have you noticed how many locked car deaths we see now? You notice that on the other channel, they talk about it all the time. How many more people are dying in cars because they heat up so quickly?
Yeah.
So again, these are all signs of that thermal energy penetration. So, and we're seeing what we think might be some signs of X-ray reaching the surface now too, and they're not going to disclose it. Don't pay attention to what you feel. Everything's fine. Ozone layer is getting better. Couldn't be further from the truth. So we had no other dangers. That alone is an immediate existential threat. So back to the nuclear part, our atmosphere is so compromised now that if we get a large CME, a coronal mass ejection like the Carrington event in the 1800s, if that happens now and it shuts down grids around the globe, we'll have nuclear plants that can't cool themselves. We have 442 nuclear plants online right now. We're going to have a whole bunch of Fukushimas at that point related to climate engineering and the damage it's done to our atmosphere. If we have a few dozen Fukushimas, game over. We're done. I mean, it'll cause nuclear plants to not be able to cool themselves with grid shutdowns that are a result of the large coronal mass ejection. Everything is connected.
Well, Dane, you don't have a lot of good news for us.
I do have this good news. If I can have this good news, that and if we're for a reason, that's the exercise of our God-given will appropriately. And what greater mission could we have than to stand up and face this head on, to face the storm head on, and whatever happens, if we're found at our post, that doing what we know we should be doing, that story ends well, period. And however long the odds look against us, and I've given this example before, but it's appropriate, I'll give it again. If your child was in a burning house and you knew you had almost no chance of saving them, would you not try?
Oh, 100%.
100%. 100%. And if we all try together, who knows what we can accomplish?
Indeed. No, folks, you guys got any other questions for us? You know, one thing one of the things that from the last podcast, after I started doing some additional research after talking with you, Dane, is I was surprised at how many actual, and I was actually showing my screen as I looked through those, but there are now plenty of, there's a lot of geoengineering programs out there, both from a studies standpoint. You can actually go to, there was one in Harvard, there's other different companies and schools that are doing geoengineering, that have geoengineering programs. I don't know what those entail completely, but the fact is, it is a thing that is happening. I think that people need to be aware of it. And we definitely see a level of greed that is a level of greed and power. And we always go back to, you know, I was actually listening to Joe Rogan today on he was talking about COVID actually, and they were talking about money. And again, you know, when I look back at COVID, I don't think that was about money at all. I think from a government level, it was all about control. And I still think that. And yeah, of course, you know, Pfizer and all these other pharmaceutical companies made lots of money on it. But I think that's just a byproduct of it. I think it was 100% about control. Had very little to do with money. I mean, of course, you know, they're going to profit off all this stuff to begin with, but it is about mass manipulation. And I think that was a case study, or just a study. It was just a social experiment to see how far they could go, and it was shocking. It was shocking to me to watch Americans fall for this bullshit. I mean, it was just utter nonsense that just, you know, completely ridiculous. You're telling me to wear a mask that I know isn't going to do anything. Not only just like a mask. It wasn't even like for instance, during that time I was traveling a lot for the government. So I was flying a lot. And you had to have some sort of cloth mask. And I had this one, you know, I actually have about 4 different cloth masks, but these are cloth masks that I'm wearing around. It's just kabuki theater. They weren't like N95. They didn't require that. And even N95 does nothing against viruses. Anybody with half a brain and a freaking, you know, a device in your hand can look that up. It does nothing for viruses. So just along with that and all the other stuff that just, you know, people requiring to wear masks while you're swimming, or closing down beaches, parks, all the things that they did that so many Americans either just accepted or became part of the enforcement plan, where they're out there turning their own neighbors in. And then the rest of us, and I was guilty of some of this as well, is you're just kind of apathetic. You're like, I know this is bullshit, but I have to play along because, you know, I have a job. I have to travel from point A to point B, and all the other things that they did. It was so much more effective than I ever thought it would be. And to the most resistant among us, and I put myself in that category. But I think we do need to wake up. And Dane, I can't thank you enough for, number one, doing what you do, putting out the information that you do, putting it out in the manner that you do. You know, there's nothing I've heard you said that you haven't backed up with evidence, either directly or indirectly, on your website. And, you know, again, you know, thank you for being a voice. Thank you for finding this out. And thank you for, you know, not staying silent on it, because that's the easiest thing to do.
The gratitude's mine. If I could just back up to agree with everything you just stated, exceptional examples you gave on all fronts. You're completely correct. The whole CV-19 scenario had nothing to do with profiteering. That doesn't mean that there aren't disaster capitalists in the process that are lining their pockets. It means
Sorry, Dane. I accidentally started a video. You're good.
But you're completely correct. Those at the top are trying to thin the herd. That's what this is about. They can print as much as they want for whatever they want. They always have. For those who know how the monetary system works, and they quote Federal Reserve, which isn't federal at all. It's just printing money out of thin air. And that's why we have the U.S. military missing 30-something trillion in the last 20 years. Where did that extra 30 trillion even come from? And that's only what we know about. Yeah. They don't need money. They simply are trying to thin the herd. And the COVID thing isn't over. Okay, those, again, if there's prions or something like a prion in that mix, those are ticking time bombs that a prion can have a latency period of 10 years. It's a very insidious element, and I'm only giving one example. So that's not over. They are absolutely trying to thin the herd as fast as they can. I would argue biosphere collapse has beat them to the intersection. Now they're incredibly desperate to do things like they just did in LA, Lahaina 2.0. And we face an immediate fight for life soon, and it will come far faster than almost anybody can imagine. This is not a linear equation. I want to stress that. It's not linear. The moment key links in the chain fall out, the entire paradigm will collapse. And what's coming, so few people have any idea of how severe and how close this is.
I know you and I had a quick discussion on this, but you've referenced prions a couple times on this. Real quick, tell the audience what you're referring to, what prions are, and kind of some of the thought process behind prions possibly being in some of those vaccines.
Prion, it's related to, for example, if anybody knows what Crutchfield-Jacobs disease is in humans, or mad cow
yeah.
in bovine. So a prion is not per se a living organism, but it behaves in a way that is, you can't kill it with heat. It can have an extremely long latency period. It affects certain proteins that have a downstream cascading effect. And once it's triggered, and again, there may be some aspect of electronically stimulated biotech if some element like a prion has been engineered to be susceptible to certain frequency transmissions. I mean, in theory, that they could trigger whatever's been seeded in populations at any point of their choosing. This may be the case, but even without that, we have all now absorbed highly toxic elements that are doing damage. Whether we realize it or not, whether we admit it or not, is beside the point. It's there. It's in the precipitation. It's in the air column. It's in us, period. So the bottom line is the environment is completely collapsing. And when we have things, let me give an example. That Gary, you know, the honeybees are collapsing. You know that, right? Everybody knows that.
I keep hearing about it. I don't know that I've looked anything up, but I've heard a lot of friends talk about the fact that honeybees populations have been declining for many years.
They're not declining; they're collapsing. And so with honeybees, and your listeners can look this up. Encourage them to do so. Search bees/aluminum. We have peer-reviewed study to prove that bees are dying of massive aluminum exposure. They're dying. The study specifically states this. They're dying of symptoms that resemble Alzheimer's and dementia in a human being. They can't even find their way back to the hive. And I'm not denying other sources of damage, farm chemicals, frequency transmissions, but massive aluminum exposure in areas that are completely detached from industrial anything in the middle of nowhere. If we have peer-reviewed study to prove that, why doesn't anybody know that? I mean, if it's killing the bees, it's certainly affecting every other insect and us. And I took that data to some of the top beekeepers in Northern California. They did exactly nothing with it. Nothing. It's the human apathy that's mind-numbing. A double PhD clinical psychologist, former friend, who knows about climate engineering, who was actually sitting next to me, and your listeners can see this in the dimming, when I confronted the world's most recognized climate engineer at an international conference for his proposal of putting tens of millions of tons of aluminum into the atmosphere. And I made him admit that they had done no study to address the toxicological effects. I made him admit to that on film, on the record. It's in the dimming. But a clinical psychologist that was sitting next to me when I did that, he couldn't face this issue. He went to his deathbed after being double vaxxed and triple boosted. He died. He couldn't face this issue. A clinical psychologist. There's something wrong with the human species. There's an inherent defense mechanism that no matter how close, it's like a person standing on a train track, the train's bearing down on them with the horns blaring, the whistle flashing, and they won't move. They won't look up. They just stand there. And that's too many people in our species, and that has to change or we're done.
Yeah, you know what you're talking about again is normalcy bias, where they normalize a lot of these things. And just like this goes back to when we were talking about all the crazy things we did during COVID, this plays right into it. And Jeff Johnston states, you know, everyone knew it was crazy, all the stuff that we were doing, wearing masks with, you know, we had plexiglass in front of the cash register, but then we'd reach around and give them the cash that just came out of our pocket. All the games we were playing, we knew it was stupid and it made 0 sense. And yet we all did it. We participated. Many people got off on it and enforced it. You know, there was a point where I just stopped wearing masks, and I was just like, I'm not doing this anymore. And I'd go into a supermarket, and 5 people would accost me and be like, you know, and I just let them know that it probably is not worth proceeding. But again, it was just crazy how many people turned into brown shirts, and it made so much sense to me too when we talk about, we look back on Germany, and Germany went from a normal society to, obviously, they turned into Nazis within a very, very short amount of time. And it's the same thing. Like, people are absolutely easily radicalized, and then on top of that, we're willing to completely ignore all the signs and symptoms around us just so that we can get through our day and get through our normal routine. And hopefully, you've been doing just amazing work with this, and hopefully we're contributing to some of this, even the smallest amount. If I've changed 2 people's minds in here and opened their eyes, watching this, or in the future when people go back and watch us in the future, man, we've done something. But I definitely encourage each and every one of you to share this content. If you're not on X, get on X. And make sure that you are watching all of Dane's information that he has. He puts out a lot of good information on his X profile, but of course his YouTube, and then of course geoengineeringwatch.org. Pay attention to it. Share that content. It's the only way that any of this is going to get out. And I know, your friends and family are going to think you're crazy, but make them watch the dimming. And I think, I don't know, if they got a brain in their head, I think it's going to change their outlook on everything. Dane,
and they won't think you're crazy for long. If I could finish with that, they won't question this issue for much longer. There will be no hiding this for much longer, and that means we're on very dangerous ground. Those in power are more desperate and dangerous now than ever. But you cannot put this issue in the rearview mirror like 9/11, like COVID, like other things. This is getting bigger and more ominous in front of the windshield every single day. So as you're sowing the seeds of awareness, and I'm deeply grateful to you, Gary, all your listeners, all your followers, it's groups like yours that can do the most good, especially former military that immediately carry respect from the general population, deservedly so. So they will be more apt to listen. And again, whatever seeds of awareness you sow, they will be forced to sprout on this issue. There will be no hiding it for much longer. So keep that in mind as you're sowing those seeds of awareness with credible data. That's key. And we try to provide that. Sharing links at geoengineeringwatch.org is very helpful to sow those seeds. But there'll be no hiding this for much longer. So just know that when you're sowing seeds, getting resistance from family and friends, they will be forced to face this issue soon, like it or not.
Well, Dane, I can't thank you enough for coming on. I know you had a lot of other stuff to do, and I kind of twisted your arm to get you on here. But I appreciate all the time you spent with us. I look forward to having you on in the future. And, anytime that you got a big announcement, or if there's anything that I can ever do to help you spread your message, you have my phone number, and don't hesitate for a second to give me a call and tell us how we can help. So, I definitely want to get you on here often and bring us new information and keep us aware of what's going on. And yeah, man, just thanks for everything that you do. I really do appreciate it.
Thank you, brother. Thank you. And all your listeners, thank you, everyone.
Absolutely. All right, folks. Well, listen, we appreciate you watching. Next week, we're going to keep things loose. I'm not sure if I'm going to do another podcast next week. I will be at SHOT Show next week, but I'm looking forward. I will definitely be doing a lot of content. I actually plan on trying to get a podcast set up with a couple of other folks out there that we'll run into. Definitely Ray Helms, and maybe we'll get Eric Cortina or a couple other guys that we know on a podcast. I think that'll be fun, and we'll definitely keep you updated. But, spread this message. Yeah. And I know this is kind of outside of our normal wheelhouse, but I think it's important. Being aware is part of staying ready. And you got to know your operational environment to be able to prepare for it. So get this message out there, share it, like, subscribe, all those things that we normally do. Go check out all that information. Go finish watching The Dimming right now. Go watch it. I'm telling you, number one, it's very interesting documentary. He backs up everything with facts, and I think you'll enjoy it. But anyways, until next time, stay armed, stay ready. We'll talk to you soon. No music, Jackson. That's all right.